My name is John Wagner, and this is part 3 of Thorium Fuel, Potential and Obstacles as the Future of Nuclear Power. I'd like to start off by thanking my project teammates, Nick Stevens for his explanation of thorium reactors and their technical viability, and Fred Cerny for his analysis on how nuclear energy and thorium specifically is perceived by the public, which backs me up well to talk about one of the key focuses of our project, that being an analysis of the political and legislative obstacles faced by stakeholders that intend to incorporate thorium into the current nuclear sector. So why this matters? Now, this may seem a little dry, but if we're all going to work in nuclear power, we're probably used to that, and dry and technical analysis is generally accepted as a good thing in this industry. So this discussion is important because even if thorium is recognized as a viable alternative or supplement to the current uranium-235 reliant system of nuclear power plants, as my colleague Fred alluded to, without support, such an involved change will face so much resistance that any momentum in this project can be stalled. Most folks, I think a lot of us, can remember a major project that faced a divided political sphere and then lost momentum as regulatory bodies changed priorities, power balances shifted in legislative bodies, and or a lack of direction from the approving authorities led to the projects becoming dead in the water and then eventually scrapped because of the fall away of support that kept them going in the first place. Because of nuclear energy's position as a heavily regulated industry, that same risk is indicated when considering investment in thorium, hence this analysis. Many parts of this apply not only to thorium, but apply in general to any potential nuclear project that involves moving beyond the bounds of the existing nuclear industrial structure. On the political side of things, there are 4 main elements that affect the political atmosphere. The third one is kind of a twofer, so that's why I said 4. The influence of the existing nuclear industry, lobbying by vested interests that are not the nuclear industry, and then political resistance driven by public opinion. So the influence of the existing nuclear power industry and uranium suppliers. This stakeholder has a conservative stance due to an already vested interest in the current system, and this tends to take the form of lobbying by major utilities with a large stake in existing nuclear infrastructure. An additional key player in this area, not quite a utility, are the fuel manufacturers themselves. BWXT, or Babcock and Wilcox Tech, as they're formally known, one of 2 keystone uranium fuel manufacturers, spent $610,000 in 2020 alone on energy bills, with a focus on reinforcing the stance of the uranium supply chains, which makes sense given their business model, but also entrenches them against new interests, such as a thorium-based model. Lobbying efforts by vested interests and their impact on policy decisions. So as my teammate, Mr. Fred Cerny, talked about, this is presented by the fossil fuel industry, which still provides that 60% of global energy. This would primarily include lobbying efforts by the fossil fuel industry and other non-nuclear energy entities in this tranche, as their motives parallel each other. None of them are particularly interested in diversifying the modes of energy production, which would include a large investment in thorium. That doesn't really apply to anything that would help their bottom line. This effort usually takes the form as general lobbying for deregulation of the fossil fuel industry rather than lobbying against the nuclear industry. But as long as investment can be assured for fossil fuels, it increases our reliance on that fuel source as a society and as a global market, which will then discourage further research and investment in nuclear energy, to include thorium. And then public opinion. So as my colleague Fred discussed, the public opinion of nuclear energy has some peaks and valleys. The main concerns brought to the table appear to be concerns about nuclear proliferation, that being the possibility of the fuel being used for these projects being used for nuclear weapons, and effective waste management. So this requires a twofold effort by our regulatory and governing bodies to address. The first, regarding nuclear proliferation, is a matter of education. To briefly summarize, Uranium-232 by itself is not capable of sustaining nuclear fission and thus not likely to be seized for proliferation. There are additional risks with the handling of thorium-232 and its products afterwards that also make it unlikely to be seized for proliferation. So what this comes down to with the political feeling toward thorium is that this is a matter of educating the public and the policymakers on these terms and these conditions, which is simple in concept but difficult in practice, as I'm sure anybody who's had to take an educator's role can agree. The second concern is waste management. So this is a crucial area of discussion because it's both an area of concern for the current nuclear industry and a notable selling point for thorium. To iterate that, one of the larger concerns with the current nuclear power industry as a whole is the problem of waste management. There are a lot of tentative solutions in the works, but at the moment, the United States is lacking a permanent storage site for spent fuel. We came close in 2002 when President George W. Bush authorized work on the Yucca Mountain Waste Repository in Nevada. But as that project developed, local stakeholders determined that the area wasn't properly vetted and several lawsuits ensued. And this is reflective of what might happen with thorium, which is why we're talking about it now. Most notable among these lawsuits, and what is likely reflective of what could face a thorium project if public support is missing, is the state of Nevada, Clark County, and city of Las Vegas versus the United States Regulatory Commission, in which it was contended that the NRC failed to assert that the repository had sufficient barrier systems. It failed to assert that the mountain complied with EPA standards for repositories, and it also asserted that the NRC itself illegally relaxed their own standards in order to certify the site as safe for a repository. Essentially, the lawsuit claimed in broader terms that the NRC did not do its own job when determining if the Yucca Mountain site was safe to build a nuclear repository, putting the public of Nevada and the larger public in the surrounding areas at risk. So this case file discussed some fairly subjective material regarding the NRC's compliance, or lack thereof, to standards set forth by its own policies. And the problem is that this same type of subjectivity that's seen in that case could be seen if a thorium project were to move forward. The danger with this type of case is not necessarily the factuality of these cases themselves, but the delay and expense that is caused by addressing these cases. And due to the nature of the NRC and its justified prioritization of public safety and confidence, such cases would need to be resolved before the hypothetical thorium project could continue. Now, regarding specifically the concern of nuclear waste from thorium in public and political perception, it again comes down to education. In part 2 of our presentation, Mr. Fred Cerny discussed at length the current nuclear waste cycle for uranium. For thorium, while there are still storage requirements for spent fuel that will span several decades, this can be posed as an acceptable trade-off by comparing this storage cost and time consumption to the cost of the current uranium fuel cycle, or the environmental cost of the ongoing fossil fuel cycle. So that's why we say that thorium, as a selling point, would present an improvement over the current system, but it does not come without its own challenges. Legislative barriers. The major legal hurdles facing thorium expansion are contained within the current regulatory framework, which itself is almost entirely represented in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. As of June 2023, there are no certifications for a commercial thorium reactor, let alone a license to operate. And as of June 2023, there are no licenses granted for new reactors, period, to come online since the formation of the NRC's new guidelines, with the exception of the Vogtle complex in Georgia, seen here. And that plant has only come online in the past few months. It was April 1st that it was reported as being online. The process to get licensed for an existing type of reactor, such as the pressurized water reactors at Vogtle, is very arduous to say the least. Sticking with our Vogtle example, in 1989, the NRC introduced Title 10, Part 52 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which accounts for the issuance of early site permits, standard design certifications, combined licenses, standard design approvals, and manufacturing licenses for nuclear power facilities. Since its introduction, Vogtle is the only facility to obtain such licensure under Part 52. Because a thorium reactor would fall under the purview of Part 52, any thorium-using design would need to pass through the same scrutinizing process. This will be markedly more difficult because, unlike Vogtle, there are no precedents set for thorium-fueled plants. And the delay the licensing process represents is likely the largest obstacle facing any thorium hopefuls on the legislative side. This leaves a potential thorium plant or otherwise thorium-involved nuclear industry with two main options. The first and most obvious being to apply for licensure under Part 52 and hope for the best. It should also be noted that the license fees alone tally well into the millions of dollars, which presents its own challenge for a reactor that likely won't begin to be profitable until several years into operation once built. Without traversing this legal framework as it stands, the root cause for the stagnation problem that the legislation would pose to a thorium project lies within the NRC system. The NRC, an independent federal agency, is charged with the following mandate, taken directly off the front page of the NRC's website. The NRC licenses and regulates the nation's civilian use of radioactive materials to provide reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety, and to promote the common defense and security, and to protect the environment. Within this policy and the deeper policy sheets of the Commission, there is a notable lack of a dual mandate, meaning that the NRC is charged with a purely restricted element of maintaining safety. There is no other incentive within its core mandate to promote the continued use of nuclear power. It's implied, but it's not really there in policy. It's generally left to the private sector to promote the continued use and development of nuclear power. But in order to enact drastic changes, such as the introduction of thorium, as we discussed, on a large scale, a revisal of the agency responsible for the largest legislative barrier to that change may be warranted, meaning an act of Congress may be warranted to change the NRC's mandate to say, hey, we need more thorium, we need more nuclear power development. Change your mandate to promote that while still assuring safety. Create a dual mandate. So thank you for your time, and I'd like to thank my teammates Nick and Fred for their work in fleshing out thorium as a potential power source on both the technical front and the public reception front.